Okay, moving on. Let's talk about cultural capital. Pierre Bourdieu is the big man to look at here. And what I love about his work and other work since is it denaturalizes the idea that taste is inevitable or that taste flows purely from form. It reconnects questions of taste to the culture you're embedded in and your particular place in that culture. And it also emphasizes how expressing the correct taste enhances your cultural status. And for me, particularly, it is a nice theory to understand how when someone's cultural capital that accrues from having correct taste is called into question. For instance, when I suggested in the first part of this presentation that things may not be intrinsically good or bad, or even more powerfully, that being able to identify whether something is good or bad according to a certain set of cultural norms may not be a particularly interesting skill, or asking whether something's good or bad might not be a particularly interesting question to ask. That quite often disrupts people's sense of themselves, and I believe the reason it does that is it undermines their cultural capital, which quite often all of us have worked quite hard to attain, and we get a good deal of cultural status from having the correct cultural capital. Now, when I teach this in class, I usually show a scene from Caddyshack to point out the difference between economic capital and cultural capital. So Rodney Dangerfield's character has economic capital but not cultural capital. That's also a very common way an established segment of society is able to denigrate newcomers who have acquired money but don't know the correct fork to use. And a classic example, or put down as nouveau riche, or recently arrived, and so forth. It's to say, well, they've got money, but they don't have class. And what you're talking about when you talk about that is cultural capital. Now, cultural capital is not stable because it depends on context. So if this is the 1980s or a certain Prius driving segment of Ashland, Oregon, having a huge car like this would not be seen as something with a good deal of cultural capital. It would be seen as this hideous throwback or dinosaur or gauche or whatnot. However, to someone like me, particularly if it's just being driven around Ashland and not taken on the highway guzzling a lot of gas, this would be a pretty great retro hipster mobile. I'd be impressed with something like this. So here's some more from the Bourdieu's sorry, talking about wine. Nice example of cultural capital. His actual definition here. I think particularly when I'm talking about this to students, I think one of the key terms when you're dealing with youth culture is authenticity, and whether you're coming off as the real deal or a poser. And just because I can describe a system like this doesn't mean I'm somehow magically outside of it. I, of course, have my own litmus test about whether people around me are the real deal or a poser. It's not as if we can simply escape this, but we can be kind of conscious of it and have a better perspective on it that way. Okay, moving on. This is originally about music. I wanted to give people another term to think about. So we've got axiology, the science of what sucks. We've got moving from questions of is this good or bad to asking is this good or bad for what and for whom. We've got the idea of cultural capital, the taste that enshrines whether something is good or bad may be contextual and may depend a lot upon where you are within a particular segment of society. And that second question about axiology, good or bad for whom, I think gets at that a little bit. And then finally, I wanted to give another criterion to think about, and that's whether something aesthetic promotes a sense of unity or whether it's defamiliarizing. So this goes back to the early 20th century, the Russian formalist. If you look at this definition, it's actually, being a child of the revolution in Russia and so forth, the formalists are very concerned to come up with a material explanation for things. When I talk about this in class, I'm usually using an overhead projector. I ask people to be quiet for a moment and listen to the sound of the projector. And then I ask them to note that they might have heard that when I initially turned on the projector, but just as our senses become habituated to something, or if it's a smell, there's this wonderful term, olfactory fatigue, where we'll smell something initially and then our nose becomes fatigued and we don't smell it anymore. And so the Russian formalists were very concerned that, just physiologically we cease to notice the familiar. And they felt one of art's jobs was to put us back in touch with the rawness and wonder of direct sensation of things. So here I've got some examples from music. Again, this was originally a youth culture class, and so I talked about kind of 80s hardcore and how the lyrics and vocals and melody and rhythm didn't always reinforce one another, and that was useful. A useful way to think about it. Oh, I've skipped ahead. One last thing I'll say about defamiliarization. Sorry I don't have a great graphic for this. One of my favorite exercises to think about defamiliarization is to imagine yourself as an alien anthropologist. And I assigned this as a writing assignment at Duke when I teach writing. And I said, imagine you're an anthropologist, you're here from another planet, and you're trying to make sense of your roommate and describe them. And I got these great papers. Students would do experiments on their roommates, like have members of the opposite sex come in if the roommate was heterosexual and see how they responded and so forth and so on. But the very, very best paper I got about defamiliarization was this guy wrote as if he was an anthropologist from another planet, and he was trying to figure out what a condom was. And he used this very scientific language, and he'd always italicize condom, the condom. And he said, I can't, I've figured out most of this stuff about humans, but I've not figured out the condom. And I've noticed, my roommate will come in with this, I can't remember what he called his roommate's girlfriend, like breeding partner or love mate or something like that. And they'll take out the condom and they'll go to another room, and then I'll hear these sounds of extreme pleasure coming from the other room. And it has something, I'm sure, to do with the condom. And one day when my roommate was gone, I procured one of the condoms, and I looked at it, and it had a silver wrapper, and I opened it up, and it had this kind of sticky, tacky inside in the silver wrapper. And after more extensive research, I have concluded that the condom is an extremely pleasurable form of candy that comes in the silver wrapper. Don't laugh, Liz. My partner is snorting. And that is my favorite all-time example of defamiliarization, because after reading that student paper, it was like 25 years ago, if I see a display of condoms in the drugstore, I think of that paper, and I think of the silver of the wrapper, and I think of the actual kind of texture of a condom, kind of in of itself, not in a habitual way, not as a sign for something. Well, I'm sure it's a sign for something, but it's put me in touch with the materiality of a condom in that way. And at its best, that is what defamiliarization does.